Hi, this is Dr. Hassard. Welcome once again to psychopathology. I wanted to talk a little bit about the title of this course because at other institutions, at other colleges and universities, this course is often called abnormal psychology. Now we're calling it psychopathology. Let's take a look at that word or that term, psychopathology. We've got two terms put together, psyche, which we usually refer to as the mind, and pathology. Now, in the medical literature, pathology usually infers that there is something wrong with the functioning of a system. There's something that is impeding the functioning. Uh, it's not working properly. So with psychopathology, we are inferring that there is something wrong with the functioning of the mind of the individual. With abnormal psychology, the use of those two words, we are implicitly assuming, by contrast, that there is something that we could call normal. So we're saying that something is abnormal in the psychological functioning of the individual. Well, what is normal? In biology, we can look at something being normal by it being average, by it being within an accepted range of probability. And in fact, in psychology, that's how we kind of define it as well. Let's take height, for example. The average height for a female is around 5'3", 5'4". The average height for a male is around 5'9", 5'10". If someone were 6 feet 7 inches tall, would they be abnormal? Statistically, yes, they would be abnormal. However, would they be pathological? Well, if their increased height is not producing any sort of disruption in their bodily function, then no, they're probably not pathological. Although there are some people with thyroid conditions who grow to abnormally uh, tall stature, and that does put a stress on their bone structure and their cardiovascular system. That would probably be considered a pathology. Well, what if someone had an IQ of 140, keeping in mind that the average IQ is about 100 with a standard deviation of 15 in either direction? If somebody had an IQ of 140, they would be abnormal. It's not normal, it's not average to have an IQ that high. But would it be pathological? Probably not. Their functioning is probably not impaired. In fact, in some ways, it might actually be enhanced. They might be able to do quite well in mathematics, in physics, and chemistry. So their increased intelligence might produce some desirable effects. However, there are many people who have very high IQs and they don't function socially in an appropriate way. Sometimes the high IQ comes at a cost in other areas of psychological functioning. So they might be more adaptive in some ways and less adaptive in others. Now, I hope you see where I'm going with this. Sometimes pathological functioning or abnormality is situational or contextual. What we consider to be the average, what we consider to be the norm, is many times based off of culture, based off of statistical frequency, or based off of the time period in which we live. So basing something as being pathological or abnormal on a difference from the average has some difficulties. So we can't necessarily say that someone has a psychopathology just by their being different. One of the second areas we could look at, if it can't be defined precisely as a deviation from the norm, as your textbook calls it, that's the first D, a deviation. If we can't really define pathology by deviation, perhaps we can look at distress. Does it cause the individual distress? Many of us have become depressed from time to time. I think that's a fair statement to make. But most of the time, our depression, our depressed mood, doesn't distress us enough to cause us so much anguish, so much psychological pain that we try and seek treatment for it. Many people engage in what we would call abnormal behavior, and it doesn't distress them. The textbook mentions the example of people jumping into freezing lakes as winter turns into spring. And we would probably look at that behavior and say we wouldn't do it because it would be extremely distressing to us. But those people take some enjoyment in it. Uh, Another example that comes to mind is bungee jumping or skydiving. I wouldn't do that because I would be extremely distressed in doing something like that, but other people enjoy it. So some people might have difficulties, psychological difficulties, but it doesn't cause them enough distress to make it noticeable to themselves or to other people. So we have two D's down. We have deviance and we have distress. And we can't really rely on either of those by themselves to label it something as a psychopathology, but they are both important. Well, what else do we have? Well, related to distress is dysfunction, is the problem causing dysfunction in a person's life. For example, again, I used the example of depression. Let's say that I am depressed on a Monday morning, and I get up and I go to work, and I am able to function in class. I'm able to function with my students. I'm able to function with my family. The, the problem I have hasn't caused me dysfunction in my daily activities. Now, let's say this depression goes on for a week or 2 weeks, and it's so bad, it's causing me so much distress, I can't get out of bed in the morning. I start missing work. My family starts being very concerned about me. So here we have clear dysfunction. Now, most of us kind of exist on a continuum of certain degrees of distress and dysfunction. Some days we might not want to get up and go to work. Some days we might feel so psychologically bad that it starts affecting us. But most of the time, we kind of snap back into a normal mode of functioning. So we have deviance, we have distress, we have possible dysfunction. Now, if we have the three of those things going together, it makes it more likely, especially the dysfunction and the distress parts, that we probably would benefit from seeking some sort of professional help from a mental health professional. Uh, but what about people who aren't distressed and don't really see that their behavior is dysfunctional? They might have a personality disorder, and we'll get to those later on in the semester, something like antisocial personality disorder, which used to be called sociopathic personality disorder. Somebody with violent tendencies, well, they might not be distressed by their own behavior, but their behavior might be dangerous to other people. It might actually be harmful, not only to themselves, but to others. And so that's another D. Is the behavior, is the psychological uh, deviance related to or causing a dangerous situation for other people or for the patient, for the client, for the individual with the issues, with the psychological problems, if you will. So we have a whole bunch of D's here going together. We have deviance, as we already mentioned. We have distress. We have dysfunction. And we have possible dangerousness, someone being dangerous to themselves or to others. Those are all things to consider. And again, I want to highlight the fact that all of these things, to some degree, exist on a continuum uh, and in a range of acceptable possibilities. We all become depressed. We all have obsessive tendencies, and you might not believe that, but we'll talk about that later on when we talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. And when we talk about schizophrenia, we'll discuss how we all have elements of psychosis within our daily life. Uh, but again, most of the time, these problems do not result in our needing professional help because it doesn't cause enough distress or dysfunction to warrant it. So when we're going through this text, I want you to keep in mind that even if you see certain traits within yourself that resemble psychological disorders, if they're not pronounced enough and strong enough to impact your life, they're probably not worthy of addressing in a professional way. Just keep that in mind so you don't diagnose yourself or other people with these traits that we're learning about. Also keep in mind, again, that these traits exist on a continuum, and that's something that makes it hard to distinguish many times the normal from the abnormal.